Here, got another video for you guys. This is breaking down more European history and the colonial algorithm, how they have programmed their code into our minds. All right, this is something serious to talk about. European thirst for dominance is a very real thing. Okay, and I'm unpacking this. This is a part of my European history series where we're educating a lot of the young minds out here because a lot of you guys don't have a clue what's going on. And even the education you receive ain't worth nothing because you're still ignorant. A lot of you guys, not all. So, a lot of times it's not what you're being taught, it's how you're being taught. It's not really generating any results from what I'm seeing. So this is the European series here. From the era of European expansion and conquest to the modern world, dominance has seldom rested only on overt military force. Rather, once physical control was established, elites moved to shape the minds, cultures, and institutions of subjugated people. So once you're subjugated, once you're conquered, now it's about how can I get into your psychology? How can I and essentially, diminish, the knowledge, the culture, the tradition, however you're thinking before I came on the scene, how can I sort of like brainwash you, right? So that's what keeps, this whole idea of European dominance, racial hierarchy. This is how it keeps it alive, right? Targeting your children, right? Targeting your women, all right? Getting them to think less of, their own people, their own cultures, and more of the dominant culture, right? So here it says, and even within their own nations to perpetuate power. This video explores how European historical legacies of war and violence evolved into subtler forms of control, programming youth, erasing competing narratives, undermining wealth building, and targeting the progenitors for future generations. This is why a lot of times you can't tell a lot of these young, folks of the dominant society anything because they're a part of that fabric of, my way is the right way, my story, my narrative, how I perceive things is the only way. So you're really wasting your time arguing with them. All right. Because life is finite, every generation faces the dilemma of legacy, how to pass on power, influence, and identity to those who come after. A lot of these dominant groups, they're going to be old and they're going to die off. All right. So they know they're not going to keep their power forever. So it's about how can I transfer this narrative to the younger people in my nation? How can I transfer this subjugation over to the younger people of other cultures? All right. I got to keep this thing going. All right. That's why it's so important about when they remove history artifacts and then when they're rewriting history and things like that, that shit matters because it's the dominant society's effort to keep the youth programmed. If I can remove all this slave shit, you guys won't have an idea of why the conditions of the black folks are the way it is. You're just gonna think these niggas is lazy. These niggas are not good. It's a moral dilemma. All right. What's up, Ulysses? So for dominant groups, this means shaping educational systems, cultural norms, property structures, and public memory in a way that ensures continuity. They recognize that children and young people are the vessels through which ideas persist, and so they become primary targets of ideological control. This applies particularly to marginalized groups whose material and cultural foundations must be systematically weakened to prevent intergenerational challenges. I gotta weaken your culture. All right. You black folks coming in here with all this warrior spirit and all this history and tradition, you Indians with all this speaking to the land and speaking to nature. I gotta erase all of this. All right. There's no way my dominance is going to continue if I keep you guys in this state of power and control. All right. So I have to, as much as I can with all my power, weaken sort of like the teachings and the pillars that are in your mind. All right. So a lot of times they're targeting the youth, they're targeting the women, like I said. So this applies particularly to marginalized groups whose material and cultural foundations must be weakened, systematically weakened to prevent intergenerational challenge. In the case of Black Americans, as one example, mechanisms of dispossession through slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, redlining, predatory lending, and economic exclusion have together gutted generational wealth and blocked the passing of resources to younger people. Simultaneously, the dominant culture often erases or whitewashes African and Black history, omitting competing narratives from school curricula and public memory. The result, many youth grow up in a context where they see little of their ancestors' achievements, values, or resistance. All right. Furthermore, these strategies often intersect with gender dynamics because women are biological and social bearers of future generations. Control over them through economic dependency, cultural messaging, reproductive regulation, or social norms is also a point of leverage. Dominant systems may disparage female roles in cultural transmission or block their access to resources, undermining their ability to nurture identity and generational continuity. With men also sometimes systematically are systemically removed, with men also sometimes systematically removed through mass incarceration, war, displacement. They are denied the capacity to teach or anchor youth in counter narratives. This video will trace how these strategies evolved over time, their building blocks, and how they persist till this day. All right. So 15 strategic mechanisms that the dominance of the society keeps a lot of their legacies going because they know a lot of these elites, as they get aged, they're aging out, they're going to die out. All right. They're not going to be here forever. All right. That's the curse of the flesh. So how can I keep this going? How can I keep the youth and these women on my code? So, colonial education systems as identity control. During the height of European colonialism, colonial powers instituted school systems in subjugated territories that prioritized European language. I need you to adopt my language. Don't be speaking all that native African tongue, all that native Indian tongue, all that, speak this English. Speak this good old King's English, all right? So that's one way that they psychologically erase a lot of your history is by substituting your traditional native language with their language. All right. So it says here they prioritize European language, culture, history, and worldview while denigrating or suppressing indigenous knowledge, languages, and belief systems. After independence, many post colonial states retained those schooling systems. So the narrative control embedded in them remained. This is a key way ideas about who is civilized and who is backward and whose history matters are transmitted through generations. In the US, a parallel occurs when schooling centers Eurocentric history and marginalizes Black and Indigenous contributions. Textbooks often omit or distort the sense of colonialism, slavery, and racism. You see this today. This shapes pupils' sense of belonging, self worth, and historical imagination. Some niggas will say, like, oh, well, we need to remove this slavery and all these whips and chains out of the schools, Randy. We're tired of playing the victim. You Negroes are not the victim. That's a really short-sighted, narrow-ass way of thinking. Just because you keep history in the textbooks and you keep it in the classrooms doesn't mean everybody is playing the victim. All right. This is if you're going to leave out some parts of the story, you need to leave out other parts of the story. It's okay to talk about fucking Christopher Columbus coming up over here, right, and running shit. It's okay to talk about, George Washington and all of these different patriarchs of the nations and how they, started the country. So why is it not okay to talk about, slavery and some of the damages that were done to slavery? That's all a part of American history. You can't omit certain parts of history and say, oh, because these motherfuckers are playing the victim. But then it's like you can include other parts and it's all right. So even Black folks, you guys are a fucking joke. Not all of you, but a lot of you motherfuckers ain't really, about any sort of Black advancement and really making the fucking difference. That's why a lot of times I don't really, I used to be about uniting the Black people and, what can I do? You guys got to figure that shit out for yourself, man, because every time you try to unite Black people, every time you try to educate and you try to do your best, you'll tear apart your own fucking people. It ain't all of you guys, but you know who the fuck I'm talking to. So I don't pay you guys any fucking mind, man. Really, if you're not, a part of the movement and really trying to educate our youth, I'm not trying to hear shit you're talking about, and I'm not going to debate with you. All right, I'm not Charlie Kirk and shit. So it says here, this shapes pupils' sense of belonging, self worth, and historical imagination, effectively programming younger people to internalize the dominant narrative. All right, the Prussian European mass schooling model as a template for obedience and civics. So the Prussian system, 18th to 19th century, established a state-funded compulsory education system designed not merely to teach literacy, but to produce obedient, uniformed citizens oriented to state goals. The blueprint was exported globally, forming the underpinnings of modern schooling worldwide. In practice, this model emphasizes standardization, central curricula, bureaucratic control, and discipline. Even today, many national education systems reflect that orientation, often leaving little room for local dissenting or critical perspectives. Youth are taught official history and civic behaviors consistent with the elite's conception of order. curriculum control, and a legacy course. In many curricula, especially in Western or Western influenced systems, certain events, for example, the Renaissance, European Enlightenment, Western Industrial Revolution, are treated as inevitable, universal, and normative. Any deviation is framed as an exception or delay. This legacy course reinforces Europe as the central actor in world history and sidelines non European agency. By shaping what counts as history, quote unquote, dominant powers marginalize alternative ontologies, suppress critical voices, and neutralize their own legitimacy. You've learned that power has always belonged to certain people and that others lack the capacity of maturity to lead, right? You even see this shit on Netflix, man. Most of the documentaries around American history is all about just white European dominance, whether it's from oil, whether it's from the railroad industry. And it just, there's nothing about African contributions, even if they were fucking slaves, they still were human beings that contributed the foundation of this country. You don't see hardly anything, so that's how they shape the narrative. And don't think a lot of these natives and foreigners that are coming from different countries, they're not soaking up this shit in the media. And what do they think? Oh, these niggas ain't contribute nothing. Niggas ain't really contribute shit, to American society. Hey, what's up, Maya? Oh, nice. That's dope. That's dope. That's good. I'm glad you two kind of was able to work that out. So, language suppression and privileging colonial tongues. One of the most powerful ways to erase memory is by attacking language. European colonizers often mandated the use of their own languages and disfavored indigenous languages in administration, education, and public life. Over time, many native languages weakened or died out. All right. And younger generations grew up speaking the colonizer's language. This severs cultural continuity because language is deeply tied to identity, worldview, folklore, and meaning making. Without proficiency in their ancestral tongue, children lose access to oral histories, indigenous epistemologies, and alternative narratives, making it easier to absorb dominant ideology by default. So just taking us away from our native language, all right, disconnects us from a lot of, everybody else got their language, right? You go into a lot of these Asian different places, and the beauty salon, the nail salon, they're speaking their native language. These Spanish, you better believe they're gonna speak Spanish in circles around you niggas. You go to, all over the world, everybody speaks their native language with pride, all right? But they didn't want the Africans and African Americans to stay true to their native language because it would be a threat to this European racial hierarchical system. All right. So that's how they attacked you guys, was through the language. All right. So it says here, erasure and forgetting of physical and cultural landmarks. Dominance is also spatial. Removing monuments, renaming streets, destroying historic buildings, displacing communities, all are acts of symbolic erasure. When younger people see only landscapes shaped by dominant culture, statues, public art, names, architecture, the original culture becomes invisible. In many U.S. cities, Black and Indigenous landmarks have been marginalized or neglected. The absence of visible reminders reduces intergenerational memory and makes younger people less likely to ask, whose land was this before? Or who built this city and by what means, right? Dispossession of land and property, undermining intergenerational wealth. European expansion often involved the seizure of land and resources, displacing people and dispossessing them of their economic base. That fundamental act stripped many communities of the material basis for self determination. In the U.S., after emancipation, Black Americans were systemically denied access to land, given inferior or no credit, and later targeted by redlining and discriminatory mortgage policies and practices. Without land or capital to pass down, younger generations start with a deficit, making it hard to accumulate wealth. Redlining, discriminatory lending, and exclusion from credit markets. In the 20th century, redlining maps explicitly denied Black neighborhoods access to conventional mortgages, resulting in suppressed home ownership and lower property values. This prevented many African Americans from tapping the greatest vehicle of wealth in U.S. history, home equity. All right, over decades, this compounded. White households had the financial leverage to invest, leverage, and pass down assets. Black households were locked out or forced into predatory loans. This structural mechanism directly attacks generational wealth, asset inequality, financial exclusion, and capital market imbalances. Beyond real estate, white households had historically had greater access to stocks, bonds, business ownership, favorable loans, and investment vehicles. Black households have been excluded or discouraged from these arenas. Since wealth begets wealth, interest, capital gains, compound growth, these imbalances amplify over generations. Thus, even when incomes converge somewhat, wealth gaps persist or widen. Cultural appropriation, narrative co optation, and sanitized inclusion. Another strategy is to appropriate or superficially include marginalized culture in forms that are depoliticized or stripped of resistance, thereby neutralizing it. A token African art exhibit or Black History Month becomes a controlled space, permissible so long as it doesn't challenge power. You'd see a version of their history curated and vetted by dominant institutions, where the more radical or oppositional voices are excised. Thus, identity is reinforced only within safe, non threatening bounds. All right. Criminalization, incarceration, and disruption of family structure. Dominant systems may use law enforcement, punitive criminal justice, and mass incarceration disproportionately against Black men, effectively removing them from communities and from their role as cultural transmitters. This weakens familial and communal stability and reduces the capacity of households to sustain counter narratives and generational memory. When men are absent due to imprisonment, policing, deportation, children lose potential mentors, all right, instructors and anchors to historical traditions or lessons that diverge from the mainstream narrative. I can rule these men out the home. They're the cultural transmitters. They're the conveyors of our history. They're the pillars of our origins as a people. If I can get you niggas out the house, right, that handicaps your children in receiving information and data about who they are, you know. And that's why you have this gender divide, because the women are looking at like, well, the white guys have all the resources, they have all the power. Randy, if I get robbed, or if my house is on fire, I'm gonna call the firefighters and the police. They're gonna be white. You know, that just makes us look even more fucking, irrelevant. It makes you look just disposable. So don't think these women don't pay attention to that shit. All right, they care about security, they care about safety, they care about generational wealth. And if you niggas ain't got no money, they're not gonna go back to the history books and be like, oh well, you guys had, the Greenwood District and Black Wall Street, and sorry, you lost all that wealth, and yeah, maybe your family had houses, and they were redlined. Okay, sorry, they don't give a fuck. They care about the now. All right, they don't. A lot of these younger people can give a damn. Not all. They can give a fuck about the history. If you ain't got, show me the money. All right, nigga, that's what they're thinking. So, all of this shit kind of played into that. So of course the women are gonna look down on the Black men. The Black men, they're mad, they're resentful, we're angry, right? Taking out that anger in the music, and we have a right to be angry, but if you're not using that anger constructively and you're just tearing up shit, you just look worse. So that just furthers the divide. All right, it really does. You know, so of course, the Black man ain't gonna look desirable to a lot of women. You motherfuckers ain't the face of wealth, generational wealth, infrastructure, right? The system. Hell yeah, they gonna go to these white men or whoever looks like them, because they have the fucking power. All right. So that further divides you guys breeding in this motherfucker. All right. Hey, what's up, Stud Studios? It's going all right, man. Just trying to get this history out, man. Get this knowledge out as much as I can. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, the Tigers, they play today. I know, right? How you been, man? How's life been treating you, Stud Studios? So, mass media control, propaganda, and ideological framing. Dominant groups hold disproportionate influence over broadcasting, publishing, film, news, social media, and popular culture. Through selective framing, they present narrated versions of history, filter present events, and marginalize dissenting voices. Youth learn from screens more than they do from elders. So, controlling media is a high leverage strategy. Over time, even fringe ideas are co opted, caricatured, or neutralized. Youth are taught through repetition, normalization, and saturation of dominant themes, thus molding collective consciousness subtly but pervasively. Policymaking, regulation, and institutional gatekeeping. All right. Beyond cultural tactics, dominance is maintained through laws, tax codes, zoning, educational funding, public school boards, accreditation bodies, federal grants, philanthropy with selective priorities and legal constraints. right? These are levers that determine who has access to capital, who gets funding, and whose buildings are preserved or demolished. Because these levers operate structurally, they often appear neutral or technical, thus making it difficult for youth or communities to see the architecture of control behind the choices, right? Even with this whole thing with Three-Eye Atlas, man, they don't know if it's a comet, if it's a UFO, is it a comet, if it's a UFO, if it's a comet, a UFO. And, they have a lot of data. They got all the technology in the world in NASA and in the United States. But right when this thing gets as close as it can to the Earth, right? I want to say like sometime in this month, it's going to get close to the sun. They have all this telescopes and lenses that can see millions and millions and billions of years out. You mean to tell me you can't tell me what this thing is, right? So they NASA wants to control the narrative as much as they can, where they shut down facilities, they shut down a lot of the different research and observations, and they wait and give it more time to see this thing shape shifting and doing all kind of shit, right? Because it's about controlling the narrative, right? Controlling what they see in the public eye, all right? And a lot of people who are young researchers are coming up in the game, right? They don't peer review you, you don't get these different accolades. Everything is so hierarchical in America, right? They know what they're doing, with the information and gatekeeping, a lot of this information around this Three-Eye Atlas thing. So it's the same way with history, right? They want to control and they want to orchestrate what part of history is told, what part is left out. So historical violence, elimination of descendants, and suppression of alternative elites. As you notice, certain European and colonial elites who tried to preserve competing narratives are in power. So you had white folks who were trying to put the history out there, and they were trying to keep the integrity of our culture and just what was going down. But a lot of times they would get murdered, they would get ostracized, they would get killed off, or their voice would get diminished. So even the white people who were trying to stand up and fight, to keep history in the textbooks, they'll lose their jobs, their family would get threatened. This shit is crazy in America, man. It's fucking crazy, man. So certain European and colonial elites who tried to preserve competing narratives or empower indigenous elites were often killed. You see that shit? America's they ain't even want you, even if you were white. If you're trying to, empower, these elites and different indigenous groups and bring them up, they'll kill your ass off, exile you, or suppress you. This removes alternative generational lines of power. Indigenous leaders, black intellectuals, or abolitionists were neutralized to prevent them from passing counter narratives to youth. By extinguishing or discrediting rival lineages of wisdom and resistance, the dominant narrative obtained fewer challenges in subsequent generations. The memory of dissidents is often marginalized, their works hidden or banned, so youth lack reference points for alternative paths. Economic dependency and unequal trade relationships. European empires built global trade networks where colonized regions supplied raw materials and consumed manufactured goods from Europe. This dependency structure prevented industrialization and capital accumulation locally. Even after formal independence, many states remain economically subordinated via debt, trade imbalances, and structural adjustment policies. This means youth in formerly colonized or marginalized regions grow into constrained economies with limited opportunities and external constraints, making autonomy or thought or action more difficult. Selective memory, revisionism, and educational censorship. Dominance also requires controlling the archive, which histories were published, taught, preserved, and acknowledged. Revisionist history often omits genocide, enslavement, colonial violence, and exploitation from national narratives or reframes them as benevolent, civilizing missions. Youth educated under those narratives are unlikely to question the foundations of the system. Efforts to decolonize curricula or restore suppressed histories are often met with political backlash, censorship, or silencing. Right? Present day synthesis and impacts. Over time, these strategies accumulate, reinforcing each other. Young people raised in environments where their ancestors' agency is invisible, where economic inheritance is blocked, where media and schooling constantly affirm dominant narratives, and where community structures are disputed, are far less likely to challenge the existing order. Meanwhile, dominant groups continue to benefit from structural privileges and cultural legitimacy passed down across generations. In recent decades, mass incarceration, the school to prison pipeline, surveillance, digital media framing, gentrification, removing black neighborhoods or historical landmarks, and privatization of infrastructure are contemporary extensions of those older strategies. The logic remains: control the narrative, choke the resource flow, disrupt familial transmission, and maintain ideological uh, hegemony. Importantly, resistance is ongoing. Movements to restore indigenous languages, preserve Black history, enact reparations, decentralize education, and support community wealth building and reclaim public memory are all counter strategies. The youth who rediscover suppressed narratives become catalysts for systemic change. Right? Yeah, man. So we're in a fucking war, man. We're in a fucking war, man. And you know, shit. He's like, what can you do? It's like you can barely even really educate your community on YouTube because they have a lot of, you know, content restrictions. And, you already know these white folks who don't want to hear that shit gonna report your ass and flag you. And even people who work in YouTube who don't want to hear that shit gonna, close your channel down. So it's like, what the fuck can you do, man? People complain about, oh, black people should do this, black people should do that. But every time you try to do something, they're trying to censor your ass. So it's like, you guys, what the fuck, I want to hear a lot of you Europeans and you white folks, what the fuck should black people do in this type of situation against this type of opposition? What the fuck, what are the solutions, right? What are the fucking solutions? It's not really what you can do. It's almost like what you allowed to do, you know. Shit's fucked up, man. How it's set up, man. And a lot of the black people, not all, they've given up on the shit. They give up, man. They're like, I'm done, man. I don't care. As long as I can work, feed my family, and take care of my kids, man, I don't give a fuck. It's just let me just do what I need to do, man, and die in peace, Randy. I don't want to rock the boat. And this job is hard to get, man. It's tight out here, man. I don't want to lose this opportunity. Man, shit's fucked up, man. How they psychologically have done my people, man. You know, it's like, and there was some good white folks, man. It's fucked up how they killed them all, exiled them, and suppressed them too, man. The white people who were trying to, keep the integrity of history and to really power up, the black people and the indigenous groups, man. But I'm talking about black people because even indigenous groups don't give a damn about niggas, man. It's like I'm talking about the fucking black man. You know, it's just fucked up how this shit is set up, man. And over generations of time, that wealth accumulates. You get what I'm saying? What you're seeing now, a lot of these motherfuckers didn't just pull billions out the air, man. This shit was built this way. It was designed this way, man. So yeah, man, I just wanted to talk about that history, you know. And I know a lot of you guys not, this is for who it's meant for. A lot of you people don't give a fuck. You guys just as long as you can eat, wipe your ass, and get your creature comforts, you don't give a fuck about any deep critical thinking and systemic issues. You don't give a damn. And that all that shit is by design too, man. So appreciate you guys for tuning in, man. Just pray for our people, man. You know, I really love the black community, you know, but it's just so complicated and so complex. It's like, how can you help, when there's so much shit in place, there's so many booby traps, so many psychological, political, legalistic infrastructures in place. It's like you're basically powerless in America to do anything for black people, man. you know and black people, their ears are itching. They're tired of hearing black history. They're tired. They're agreeing with the white folks. Yeah, man, remove that slavery shit out of here. Stop playing the victim. They're speaking like the motherfucking dominant society, man. They're losing hope too. It's like to talk about your history and to really educate black people and to really put them on the same page about what's been going on, so that way they can know how to strategize. You're the victim. You're playing the victim. They done threw that shit out there, or you're the left. It's like the shit's a fucking joke, man. In America, man, it's a fucking joke, man. So I'm just praying for black people, man, that they'll wake up, man. And it's like, even if coming together may not solve everything, but at least if you're gonna have to die out anyway, at least if you die out together as in unity is better than just dying out fragmented and disjointed. you know so that's all I had, man. YouTube, I'm seeing ain't really the place to really, power up black folks and to really get into Black history like that. If you ain't shucking and jiving and tap dancing and doing a bunch of bullshit, man, they don't really give a damn. So I'm about to be out, man. Peace.